Jonathan Spencer, and the title of his presentation is Elected Officials' Role and Leadership in Stormwater Management. Jonathan is a graduate of Clemson University with both a BS and MS in civil engineering. As a registered professional engineer in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Texas, he has over 17 years of experience in the water resources field and was named as one of the Engineering News and Records 2022 top young professionals in the Southeast. Jonathan is an experienced project manager in the areas of water, wastewater, and stormwater facilities, master planning, and water supply. In addition to serving as Garver, Carolina's practice lead, he has served as the mayor for the town of Spencer, North Carolina, since 2019. His diverse experience with municipal utilities, local government, and consulting engineering has helped him understand and tackle the complex challenges our region faces with protecting our valuable water resources. Please help me welcome Mayor Jonathan Williams.
All right, thank you, Craig. Good afternoon, everybody. Hope you're doing well. Since I am in the realm of the political world, I'm going to have to say that I must yield 10 minutes of my time to the good man from Mecklenburg County. No, this is great. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you today in this capacity. I think my presentation material will dovetail in very well with Rusty's material that he covered. What I really want to do today is take a little bit of my experience in my professional role over the years as a civil engineer, working primarily in the arena of water resources, especially in stormwater and role as elected officials is a little in with the regulation piece of it. As elected officials, we often have to deal with ordinances and regulation. And so I want to make sure that we have an understanding of that. The other piece is to highlight those state requirements and then also some of the local ordinances. I think Rusty talked a little bit about that. We're going to dive into a little bit about what are the local ordinances that we can or maybe should be implementing that, as Rusty mentioned, go above and beyond the state minimum requirements. And then, of course, the big piece of that is, well, we're talking about all these great things, but where in the world does the money come from to make it happen? And so we'll talk about some funding sources. And then finally, I want to close with the importance of our elected officials' actions and how important those decisions we make today are for tomorrow. All right, so the elected officials' role. I am relatively new in this elected official capacity. 2019, I'm serving my second term as mayor for the town of Spencer, North Carolina. We have about 3,200 residents. So we are a small town in the scheme of Piedmont, North Carolina. We are a municipality that does not have to have MS4 regulations. And we're going to talk about what that means. Most of you in here know what that means. But what I have found is a lot of our elected officials don't know what the MS4 designation is and what that means. So we'll talk about that. So really what I want to stress is understanding the process. So understanding what an MS4 is, understanding the water cycle within our region, as Rusty talked about, understanding what that means. And the next step from that is to take that to how do we then support our staff, right? Because as elected officials, we entrust our staff to work through and handle this and have the expertise to manage whether it's a stormwater program we have or manage the various projects that relate to stormwater management. Maybe the most important piece of that, though, is setting the vision, right? We have to embrace a vision that really holds water, wastewater, and stormwater management as equals. And so you're going to hear a little bit today about this one water approach. Many of you have heard about what that is, but I want to stress that as we start thinking about how we manage our water resources, it's not just stormwater, it's not just wastewater, it's not just water. They all intertwine together. And then the other piece of that is the development side of that and how we make all of those work symbiotically. And then as elected officials, making sure that we're proactive, that we're going beyond what the minimum requirement is. And there's good reason for that. And then I also want to touch on considering green infrastructure. It's a term that some of you may have heard. It's gaining more and more popularity. I'm going to talk about the benefits of green infrastructure and how that how it's a new approach to how we've considered stormwater management for years and years. And then most importantly, I think beyond the do is here's what we don't need to do as elected officials that I see so often happen. We don't need to sacrifice our standards for the sake of economic development. So in Spencer right now, we have about 3,200 people, right? We've got $600 million of economic development that's on the books getting ready to happen. Going to completely reshape our community. It's going to increase our tax base by over 25%. That's huge, right? The piece of that, though, is making sure that we're not sacrificing our water quality, our community feel, those sorts of things as that economic development happens. And so one of the things we want to make sure is that we're not lowering our standards to attract that economic development. The other thing is to treat stormwater management, not to treat stormwater management as subordinate. So we see so often. I work with water and wastewater utilities and also with stormwater utilities. Water and wastewater utilities are an enterprise fund, right? So they're funded on their own by the revenue that they generate. So they're kind of their own entity. They operate together, or they operate and they're self-sustaining. Stormwater, whether you have a stormwater utility and generate fees for it, usually those fees aren't enough to actually cover the entire program, right? You don't offset your operating cost. For a town like Spencer, we don't have a stormwater program. We'll get to that. Yeah, we're talking about those sorts of things, and that's going above and beyond the minimum because we're not an MS4, so we don't have to have a stormwater utility. But it's something that we're talking about potentially implementing and going above and beyond. But those are funded through the general fund, right? And so they compete with everything else, like public safety. They compete with all those other budgetary line items. And so oftentimes we see stormwater management and our stormwater departments getting the short end of the stick when it comes to funding. So we need to make sure that we're not treating it as subordinate, because if we're going to treat water and wastewater treatment with a high regard, remember that the stormwater is what's ultimately feeding that drinking water. The other is to be complacent. The do nothing approach. Don't be complacent. We've seen this so often, and I think I'm experiencing now in Spencer in my term there, because we went decades by neglecting infrastructure and being complacent and kicking the can down the road. The problem with that is you reach a point that you've kicked the can long enough that all the cans are piled up. And that's what we're dealing with now, is replacing failing infrastructure and having to do that at a time where it's tough to get materials, it's tough to get labor, and it's not cheap right now. So the other piece of that is don't underfund. And we talked a little bit about that, not treating your stormwater utility as subordinate. Don't defer maintenance, something else that we're seeing. And then most importantly, don't make decisions today that might harm the future. So a little bit about the basics, and in order to try and get us back on time, I'm not going to really dive into the whole MS4 program. Many of you are familiar with it. If you're an elected official participating today and want to learn more, ask your local stormwater department. They can bring you up to speed on it. But polluted stormwater runoff is the #1 source of surface water pollution. Okay. And so regulation when it comes to stormwater is really set to target those urbanized areas. Rusty mentioned the urbanized areas and how that's where you see most of those pollutant constituents. And so what the EPA has said when they regulated this is they want to really target the urbanized areas because that's where most of the pollutants are coming from. And so if you look at this, regulated stormwater systems are only about 4% of the total US land area. However, that constitutes 80% of the US population, right? So that makes a lot of sense. Small area, all of that population packed in that small area, 4% of the US, of course, we want to focus our efforts there on managing stormwater runoff. So what is an MS4? It's a very easy way to say a very long name. That's a municipal separate stormwater system, also known as an MS4. It's part of the Federal Clean Water Act, okay? And so it is basically, it's any entity, whether it's a town, a state, city, that basically discharges to waters of the United States, so navigable waters. And it's essentially conveying water that's used to collect and move stormwater. So that could be pipes, drains, ditches, anything like that. The key distinction is it's not a combined sewer. We don't have to worry about that in the North Carolina, but there are a lot of other places, highly urbanized areas, especially up north and elsewhere, that have combined sewer systems to where basically they were treating stormwater and sanitary sewer as the same. And so they have to have very big systems to be able to hold all that water, because basically here we would inundate our wastewater plants if they were together. So this is why you see a lot of places where they have the systems that are combined sewer systems. They have these huge underground tunnels and things like that that they use to store all that stormwater so that they don't inundate their wastewater plants. We don't have to really worry about that. So we're focused on a municipally separate stormwater system. And that's what we see in North Carolina. So it's not part of a sewage treatment plant or a publicly owned treatment works facility. So MS4s are everywhere. Spencer's an MS4, right? But we're not a regulated MS4, because regulated MS4 systems have to have a permit. Okay, so why are MS4s regulated? Here's why. Key takeaway: urbanized areas have about 55% of their area is runoff. There are many pollutants. A natural system where you have forests, where you have grasslands, that sort of thing, about 10% of that runs off. And you have very few pollutants because nature's doing the work to filter out those pollutants. Plus, you don't have all of that development in one area. And so you're not getting the number of pollutants as well. So this is a little look at a MS4, a separate storm sewer system, compared to that combined sewer system that we talked about. On the left there, you will see that is the MS4. Okay, and so you will see it is distinctly separated from your sanitary sewer system. Sanitary sewer goes from homes and buildings to a wastewater treatment plant. That treated wastewater then gets discharged through an NPDES permit into a receiving surface water. You have a stormwater system that's totally separate. You're collecting water from inlets and curb and gutter, ditches, that sort of thing, that ultimately gets discharged through a pipe into the receiving body of water. It is a point source discharge, but it's different than the treated wastewater. Whereas in the combined sewer system, you'll see there, as we talked about, everything's connected together, and they allow it to overflow, because the approach with combined sewer systems is dilution is the solution. So it's a good thing we don't do that here in North Carolina. So NCDEQ is delegated by the EPA Region 4, which we're a part of, to implement the MS4 program. And so they have authority over it. So ultimately, we're responsible to the EPA, but through NCDEQ. And so basically what you'll look at here is the evolution of the NPDES process. So in North Carolina in the 90s, we basically had 6 large phase 1 MS4 permittees, of which Charlotte was one of those. And then, of course, North Carolina Department of Transportation. Then in the 2000s, what we had was 115, what we called phase 2. And those are the smaller MS4 permittees that were added, which are a lot of the members of this coalition. And so in 2020, we had a census. And so you'll see here 2023-ish is when the new MS4 designations are supposed to come out. And so there is a chance that people that were not in MS4 regulated municipality before, sometime this year, or later, will become an MS4. Okay, so that's why it's important to understand this process, because even if you're not a regulated MS4 now, you may be in the near future. We talked a little bit about this. I'm going to skip over this in the interest of time, and this one as well. But I want to really focus on this. So how you get designated as a candidate for a regulated MS4. Obviously, if you have the potential to have an adverse impact on water quality, you're probably going to become an MS4. The other is concentrated population, and this is really important because Rusty hit on it. We are seeing an evolution of population growth, and we're seeing certain areas that once were very rural are now becoming very populated. And as we see those becoming populated, what we're seeing is that concentrated population is going to raise the flag for certain municipalities to become a phase or become a MS4 regulated municipality. The other is if there is a TMDL implementation plan specifically listing the MS4. So it's possible that you may have an impaired water body that a TMDL is developed for. And if that TMDL indicates that your municipality could be a contributing factor to part of what that TMDL is, the high likelihood they're going to put you under that MS4. But the rationale here is, as I mentioned before, concentrated population equals concentrated development, which ultimately leads to concentrated pollutants. We're also going to skip over that in the interest of time. I want to talk a little bit about going the extra mile. So local ordinances are your tool as elected officials and stormwater managers to go the extra mile, to go beyond the state minimum that an MS4 program requires. And so you can, and you probably should have local stormwater management ordinances. It goes back to the shoe that Rusty was talking about, right? You need to pick the shoe that's going to work for your municipality in your watershed. Local ordinances cannot be less than state minimum, but they can be greater than state requirements. So some examples include enhanced buffers, more stringent requirements for SCMs or stormwater control measures, pre-construction and post-construction requirements that are greater than the state requirement, and then maximum impervious surface areas for development. Right. So if you have large developments going in, you can require a particular amount of impervious, a maximum amount of impervious surface area that goes in. That's why a lot of places you're going to see where they'll have certain paved area, but to meet that requirement, what they end up doing is putting pervious pavers in certain areas to allow infiltration. The other is more stringent erosion and sediment control measures, right? And that's to cut down on sediment loading with turbidity, as well as constituents like heavy metals and things like that may be running off. So it really is a balancing act, right? It's about promoting responsible development. It's not about not developing, because, for instance, I said $600 million of investment in the town of 3,200 people. For us, that's huge. It's game changing, right? For us, it allows us to do so much more for our residents and our community. So we don't want to shun that development, but we want to do it responsibly. And so that's what it is. It really is that balancing act. And so you'll see a tale of two cities here. Obviously, you recognize the one on the left. It's Charlotte. It's a regulated MS4 community. They've got a significant stormwater utility with dedicated staff. They have stormwater fees that they charge. They have a stormwater management plan. They're doing a ton of ongoing education and outreach. They do asset inventory and monitoring and condition assessment of their utility or of their infrastructure. And then you have us in Spencer. Many of you know Spencer as the home of the North Carolina Transportation Museum. If you have kids, you may have taken them there for the Polar Express or for Thomas the Train. And it's a great tourism draw for us in our little town. But we're a non-regulated MS4 community. So beyond our goodwill and our understanding of why it's important to take care of our water resources, we don't have a regulatory requirement that MS4 regulated communities have. So we have limited asset inventory. We have limited funding mechanisms. We have no dedicated staff solely focused on stormwater. Limited internal knowledge. I'll say that was one of my big platforms when I ran for mayor, is that I brought that knowledge. But you know, the reality is most small towns don't have the capacity and the internal knowledge of stormwater management and the importance of it. We do limited outreach. That's changing a lot in the past few years. Limited monitoring and a very reactive approach, which we are also changing and going to a more proactive approach with our assets. But, you know, the old fix it when broken approach, we've done that for many, many years. And so as elected officials, we say, yes, we want to take care of our water resources. We want to do, you know, we want to invest in our stormwater management. Well, it's time that we put our money where our mouth is. And so we talked a little bit about that enterprise versus the general fund aspect. There are other ways beyond your general fund to fund that. Stormwater utility funds, by establishing a stormwater utility and charging your residents and businesses a stormwater fee. That is also a helpful way to generate revenue. It's not going to offset your cost for doing a stormwater program and managing it correctly, but it's a tool. The other are bond programs, right? And so we see a lot of places will actually package a bunch of those projects into bond packages for it's good. It's a good way to sell roadway improvements along with drainage improvements and stormwater management improvements, and then grants. And so this is one of the cool things with Spencer. We've really been successful on the grant side. We've got folks that have spent their careers with other larger municipalities as planning directors and things like that. And so that we're just fortunate to have them, a lot of them in part-time positions, but they've come in, they're writing grants for us, administering them. And so we've been fortunate enough to have to invest very little of our own money and being able to rely on programs that the state and federal government have given to us. The key is where there's a will, if you want to do it, there's a way to make it happen. And so these are just a few. I don't know if the slides are going to be available after the presentation. These are links to some sources for various stormwater funding sources, both at the federal level and the state level. The Local Assistance for Stormwater Infrastructure Investments Program, the LAS2, Town of Spencer just got about $2 million from this program from the state to be able to take care of one of our drainage issues that we're having on one of our streets in town. So would definitely encourage that you check that out. When it comes to green infrastructure, they're really trying to thinking outside the pipe. Okay, so the difference between green infrastructure and gray infrastructure. Gray infrastructure is what you're all probably used to. That's curb and gutter on a roadway, an inlet, there's a pipe that then ultimately takes that out to, maybe it takes it to a detention or retention pond, but ultimately it flows out to a stream or to a lake. Okay, so you'll see that in the pictures at the bottom left-hand corner. But at the right, what you'll see are pictures of what are green infrastructure. And so they are different measures that use natural processes to address both stormwater quantity management and quality management, right? So you're helping to address flooding issues, as well as helping to address some of the water pollutant issues that we were talking about. And so you're essentially using the natural environment to filter all of that out. You're slowing the water down and you're taking the pollutants out of it. So one of these pictures you'll see is actually a park. This, I believe, is in Atlanta, that was developed as it was really developed initially as a stormwater control measure. And billions of dollars of investment and development built up around it. Now, Rusty may tell you, well, that seems to contradict itself, right? Because you developed the stormwater control measure and it promoted more development. It's that balancing act, right? And so what you're able to do is build your stormwater control measures in so they don't look just like a retention pond or something like that, that it becomes an amenity for your community. It becomes a draw for people. So some examples of green infrastructure: permeable pavements, green streets and alleys. We're actually planning a park in our downtown that's going to be like this, as well as some restriping of our main street through town and incorporating some green infrastructure in that for stormwater management, but then also to help with the aesthetic of the town. Green parking lots are one. For instance, our town hall, we just moved into a new facility December of 2021. It's not a new facility. We took an old shopping center and purchased 20,000 square feet of it, converted our town hall and police department, renovated that space and converted it into our town hall and police department. Has a huge parking lot. We called it our concrete jungle or sea of asphalt out in front of that. And so we are working to incorporate in that some of the things that you saw that that I think was maybe Harrisburg or Huntersville, with basically rehabbing that, putting in some green infrastructure in that parking lot, as well as adding that park in to help with some of the stormwater management there. Some other things are bioswales. You'll see a picture there in between the sidewalk and the street. Also making sure to develop ordinances that promote an urban tree canopy. Very, very important. And then land conservation, as Rusty mentioned. And so the question that everybody as elected official, I know I ask it, and I'm sure everybody does, they'll say, why green infrastructure? Doesn't it cost more? Well, maybe not. So here's some examples. Project one, you have a stormwater issue you got to take care of. So you're going to address it with gray infrastructure. You're going to put pipes in, inlets, curb and gutter, culverts, all of that other stuff. Project two, you're trying to improve your downtown Main Street, right? You're wanting to do aesthetic improvements. And so you have to do streetscape, green space, parks, etc. Those are expensive projects when you add them together. But if you consider implementing green infrastructure in there, you're dealing with one project, often one contractor, and you get resilient infrastructure and aesthetic improvements in the same thing. And so what is the result of that? Well, the cost of green infrastructure is often less than the cost of gray infrastructure and aesthetic improvements, those two projects together. The benefit, though, is that green infrastructure is much greater than the benefit of gray infrastructure and separate aesthetic improvements. And that makes the cost benefit ratio considerably greater for the green infrastructure. So always consider that when it comes to upfront cost. You got to look at the whole approach. So the importance of our actions as an elected official. There are a lot of reasons we should be focusing on stormwater management and really making that a priority in our communities. For me, the importance of my actions are because I have people watching me. And those people are people like you. They're people that live in my community. But ultimately, for me, the most important people are these guys up here, my children and my children's friends, right? One of the things I got to do was present here recently for Engineers Week to several area schools about the importance of careers in engineering. And we did a water filtration exercise with them and all of that, and it was a blast. But it also made me realize that the decisions that we make today as elected officials and as stormwater management are not just impacting us, they're impacting these guys that come after us. So thank you for your time. I don't know that I got us back on time. In fact, I probably got us more behind, but it was a pleasure talking with you today, and I'll be around for questions later.
Thank you, Jonathan.